Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final class in Dr. Yedidah Koren's series on personal behavior in Halakha. Yes, I think also thank you for bearing with us. And since we're running a few minutes behind schedule, I'm just going to quickly say, remind everyone that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And, we might take a break here and there to also, ask questions where you can unmute and everything. But, again, let's not lose any more time. And so I'll hand it over to Dr. Koren. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to add before I start that this time I remembered to put my email address on the source sheet. So if questions come up or if you think of thoughts after as a result of this class, feel free to write to me. I'm really happy to hear from you. So this is our last meeting, and so we are focusing in this class on traditions of personal behavior, of rabbinic personal behavior. What we've seen in previous classes, first of all, is how much this is a building block of Talmudic discussion, how much traditions of rabbinic personal behavior in some masechtot, not in all, in some tractates, they really make up part of the halachic discourse. And alongside theoretical or prescriptive statements, we also have many traditions that describe what rabbis did. And the focus is not on what rabbis said in these cases, it's on what they did. We've also talked about for what purposes, and I would raise this as a question, why does the Talmud, why do rabbinic sources, subsequent rabbis, essentially record and transmit and study and pass on these traditions of rabbinic personal behavior? In some cases, it seems clear that rabbinic behavior serves as a proof for halakha. But in many other cases, we saw sometimes rabbinic behavior is in dispute with one another. One rabbi does one thing, another rabbi does another thing. We saw this in the first class. And then there's this machloket between rabbinic behaviors. And sometimes the rabbis behave in ways that are clearly, they're not modeling normative halachic behavior. Like in the first class, we saw that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't really say Shema, or if he did, it was the bare minimum. And in some cases, it's interesting to see how the rabbis serve as role models in interesting ways, or ways that we would have not expected, such as tired rabbis who show us what is the bare minimum of saying Shema, and they do this themselves because they also have, they're limited physiologically as well, not just normal, regular people, but rabbis in a sense are normal, regular people in these traditions. Last week, we focused on this spectrum between rabbis observing each other and criticizing and chastising each other for their behavior, a sense of rabbis policing each other's behavior or scrutinizing each other's behavior. And then at the other end of the spectrum, rabbis being just in admiration or thirsty to know what their predecessors did. And in those sources, they serve more as what we could call classic exemplars. And then there are many traditions that are just somewhere in between. The rabbis are not admired, they're not exactly criticized, but they're just reported on, their behavior is reported on. And we spoke also about how much these traditions give us a new window into what is halakha. Halakha being halakha including table manners. Halakha just being about small matters, the order of brachot, the language of brachot. And it's not, through these traditions, halakha is less what we normally would think, Jewish law, and more perhaps a practice, a way of life, forms of piety, manners, and it includes something, it's something else, it's in a different kind of realm, habits, lifestyle. What we're going to do in this class is use the traditions. In many cases, these traditions give us a window into the portrayed lives of rabbis, personal lives of rabbis in the religious sense. So they reveal a lot of individuality and creativity in rabbis innovating their own personal practices of piety. And what's interesting is that there is this interplay between rabbis being creative in their religiosity, in their piety. They make up tefillot, they create bodily gestures during davening, and then they also imitate each other doing this. And to the extent that this individuality and creativity becomes codified and canonized, and then it's no longer individual. It's no longer the personal piety practice of one specific rabbi. It actually becomes the norm. And this process as well is kind of interesting. And it makes us think, again, what is halakha? And through these traditions, halakha seems to be codified rabbinic piety, codified rabbinic religious practices. So I brought examples of from several different fields, all from brachot. So the first few examples are about bodily gestures during davening, meaning bowing, kriya ve'ishtachavaya. So the first one is the first example is the last example that we saw last week. Last week we saw it as an example for the yearning that rabbis have for the personal practices of previous rabbis. In this case, we're going to focus in this class. We're going to focus on this tradition and another one that's connected to it, focusing on the personal piety practices that of the rabbis that come up through it. Let me share my screen. Okay. So the first example is from the Yerushalmi. And so Hanan Barba, who was a student of Rav, Hanan Barba, Amar לחבריה, he told his colleagues, נמור לכון מילתא טבא, דחמית לרב אביד, ואמריתה קומי שמואל, וקם ונשק על פומי. So he tells his colleagues, he tells the others, the fellows, let me tell you a good thing, a good matter that I saw Rav do. And I told it to Shmuel, and he got up and he kissed my face. He kissed my mouth. ברוך אתה שוחה, בא להזכיר את השם, זוקף. So when he says the words in in the brachot of Shmona Esrei, Baruch Atah, he bows down, he lowers himself, and then when he comes to mention the name, he straightens up. This might be familiar because this is how we bow today. This was essentially codified as halakha, or the way that bowing should be practiced during Shmona Esrei. So it's just interesting to think about, what does it mean that this was a individual, personal practice of Rav that was then studied and recorded, and we do it today. So in a sense, what we're doing is imitating Rav's actions, or Rav's own personal gesture and bodily movement. What I like about this, this has a parallel in the Bavli, which is actually a sequel, which is kind of nice. So the sequel is that, so we had in the Yerushalmi, we had Hanan Barba, who told the colleagues about Rav's piety, and Shmuel was so excited he kissed his mouth. In the Bavli, we have Shmuel now telling Rav's son about his own father's practices. Presumably his son maybe did not know his father or see him praying. Amar le Shmuel Lechia bar Oryan, ta ve'im alach milta ma'aliyata de'ava avi levuch. What's interesting about this example is that there are differences between the versions between the text in the printed version and in the manuscript. There are different several versions in the manuscripts, but the one that was it's considered the better one of brachot. I can talk more about that if you want. So the printed edition records this as a statement. This is what your father said to do, but the manuscript records it as an action, a tradition of personal behavior. So he said to him, let me tell, so Shmuel, the son of Rav, son of Torah, let me tell you something wonderful that your father used to do, was accustomed to doing. Ki havakara kara bebaruch. I think, I accidentally cut out the ki havazakif zakif pashem, which we can see in my English translation. So it's the same behavior. This is Shmuel telling Rav's son, this is what your father used to do. You should know this. And he's presenting it as a great thing. And this, I see something in the chat. Let's see, okay, great. So this, in the Bavli, this tradition is clustered with another tradition of a different Babylonian sage that is also connected to their bodily gestures during davening. Rav Sheshet, ki kara ki chizra, ki kazakif, zakif kechivya. So Rav Sheshet, this is not about when he would bow, but how exactly he would move his body when he would bow. So we see also the minutia of it, how closely they looked at each other. They didn't only look at when they bowed, they looked at how exactly they moved their bodies when they bowed, like it's a dance movement almost that they're looking at, that they're observing. So Rav Sheshet, when he would bow, he bowed like a rod or cane, and when he would straighten up, a rod is just straight down, and then when he would straighten up, he would straighten up like a snake, kind of slowly straightening up his back. And perhaps this has to do with showing respect, something like. And so, like I said, I don't know if you remember in the first class, I said something that's interesting is that these traditions often are clustered together. So this is a case of a cluster of two. And it also is a way of thinking, raises questions as to how are these traditions transmitted? How are they studied? Were they studied as collections of traditions of personal behavior? Were they studied individually as individual units and then just brought together? So it's a question. And the final example on bowing is Rava. This is in the context of a sugya where there is actually more prescriptive theoretical statements saying how it's one should not bow in the blessing of hoda'ah, of thanking, in the beginning and in the end. However, in contradiction to this prescription, we have a recorded tradition that Rava kara behoda'ah tchila v'sof. So Rava would bow in the blessing of hoda'ah, of thanking, in the beginning and the end. This is the blessing of modim, which is what we do as well. His fellow sages asked him, Amri le Rabbanan, mai ka'avid malhachi? How could you do this? Because of the teachings that you're not supposed to actually bow both in the beginning and the end of modim. And his answer is, Amar lehu, chazina le Rav Nachman de kara, v'chazina le Rav Sheshet de ka'avid hachi. So he says, I do this because my teachers did this. I saw both Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet do it in this way. And then the Gemara says, but reminds us of this braita that was introduced before. V'hatanya, we have a teaching that someone who bows during hoda'ah, it's problematic or reprehensible. And then they explain, no, this is a different blessing of hoda'ah. It's not the hoda'ah of Shmona Esrei, and they resolve this issue. So what we see here is that the codification of the personal practices of rabbis, the imitation of personal practices of piety of rabbis, it already happens in the rabbinic period itself. Rabbis are already presenting themselves in these sources as imitating each other. Rabbis imitating their teachers, and what's also nice here is we have this juxtaposition of the theoretical prescriptions in the Braitot, and the other, in a sense, it's a different chain of mesira, a different chain of transmission of halakha. Rava doesn't say, I do this because Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet taught me. He doesn't quote a Braita, he doesn't quote a Memra. The chain of transmission is a transmission of seeing. It is a visual transmission. So this is connected to this. I'll just repeat it because this is the final class. So it's kind of, we see this in action in the beginning. In the first class, I mentioned these traditions give us a different, show a different dimension to rabbinic study and training that is still Torah shebe'al peh, in the sense that it's oral because it's happening without books, but it's not happening in the memorizing, reciting, discussing kind of way. This is, the transmission is happening through living and seeing and observing. And this is a small, the example is small, but it contains so much. So Ozzy asks, why not bow throughout Shemona Esrei? Too much humility. That's part of the discussion the Gemara is about in Masechet Brachot is exactly. It's in a sense, you shouldn't humble yourself too much, because if you humble yourself too much, almost you are actually kind of boasting in your humility. Which is an interesting, it's interesting to think about this ethos of not showing yourself too humble, but in a sense that's also arrogant. The next section of examples is on prayers themselves. So the rabbis have fixed prayers. This is what Masechet Brachot is about. The fixed brachot of Shema. They have fixed language, the fixed brachot of Birkat Hamazon. We know that they have fixed language because a rabbi was chastised for not saying it properly, as we saw in last class. Fixed brachot for Shemona Esrei. Masechet Brachot is also filled with personal prayers, or prayers that are presented as personal. I'll explain what I mean by saying that. And I give a few examples. So one is in the Mishnah already, and it's a Mishnah about Rabbi Nechunya ben Kana, who would pray in the entrance and on entering and leaving the Beit Midrash, short prayer. This was his personal practice of piety. And Amrulo, the fellows, the students, his colleagues said to him, what room is there for this prayer? Why are you saying this prayer? And he explains, when I enter, I pray that no mishap will transpire by me. And when I exit, I give thanks for my portion. So he explains why he says this prayer. This is just presented as kind of an individual, creative practice that Rabbi Nechunya ben Kana did for himself. In the Yerushalmi, we have another example of, I brought another example. This is a prayer on rain. And this example also shows us a nice chain of transmission, or a chain of observance. So Rabbi Yosei Bar Yaakov, Slak Vakra Rabbi Yehuda Migdalaya. So this is about Rabbi Yosei Bar Yaakov, who went up to visit Rabbi Yehuda of Magdala. And while he was there, Ad De'avat Taman, Nechat Mitra, Veshama Kalei. So, sorry, Nechat Mitra, Veshama Kalei Amar, 1,000 אלפים, ברבבם חייבים להודות לשמך מלכינו על כל טיפה וטיפה שאת מוריד לנו, שאת גומל טובה לחייבים. So while Rabbi Yosei Bar Yaakov was visiting Rabbi Yehuda of Magdala, the rain fell down, and he heard his voice saying, and then he was saying this bracha, thousands of thanks, we are obliged to thank your name, our King, for every single drop that you bring down for us, etc. And then he asks him, Amar le hada menalach, where do you have this from? Where is this prayer from? Amar le, he responds, Hachin hava Rabbi Simon mevarech al yeridat kshamim. And his answer is, this is what Rabbi Simon would bless for the rainfall. So this tradition is revealing Rabbi Yehuda Magdalaya carrying out or imitating the personal practice of Rabbi Simon. He didn't hear a teaching by Rabbi Simon to say this. He heard or he saw Rabbi Simon saying this. Rabbi Yosei Bar Yaakov observes this already, the imitation of the personal practice. We don't know how Rabbi Simon came up with it. Did he himself come up with it? Did he hear someone else say it? what's also I like about the terminology here, it's what I said is that these traditions reveal a more visual kind of learning Torah, visual mode of learning Torah. It's not only visual, it's what's especially core to it is that it's lived and embodied, and that it happens in a sense ad hoc. And so in this case, the verb is not about seeing, which is the dominant verb in many of these traditions. It's chame or chaze, but here it's shama k'lei amar. He hears his voice saying, but he's not hearing him say a teaching, right? He's not hearing him recite a braita or recite a memra. He's hearing his voice at prayer. He's witnessing his lived out religious piety. Let me see what's in the chat. We bow at the beginning and we bend the knee and bow at the end. Not the same. Okay. Interesting. Thank you for that. David Friedman is my uncle. I think that's David Friedman. Rabbi David Friedman. So let's continue to the next. This is the final and long example. It's the longest cluster that I've found so far of traditions of personal behavior. So let's see how long this is exactly. It continues. What is this long tradition of personal behavior? This is a long cluster of traditions of personal behavior. So the cluster is of rabbis' personal prayers after they were done with their prayer. So after they were done saying the set prayer, they added a personal prayer. And we have Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Chia, Rav Safra, Rabbi Alexandri. Then there's a different tradition that what Rabbi Alexandri used to say was really what Rabbi Menuna would say. And Rabbi Alexandri said something else at the end of his prayer. Rava's prayer is apparently what Rabbi Menuna Zute, the Rabbi Menuna the younger, would say on Yom Kippur. Marbre de Ravina, and then there's a final tradition on Rav Sheshet that it's a prayer that he would say when he would have his personal fast days. These are a lot of personal prayers, and what the sense just that this gives us is a richness, a variety of creativity, of every single rabbi having their individual personal prayer at the end of their own davening. Some of these prayers, it's unclear. It could be that the rabbis did not actually create the wording for these prayers, that these prayers might be known from elsewhere, that they were formulated in rabbis and rabbis used them. But what the Gemara is presenting here, the picture that the Gemara is presenting, is clearly a picture of many voices of individualized personal prayers at the end of davening. We have our own, right? In the Shmona Esrei that we say that we have a final prayer at the end of Shmona Esrei, but we all say the same thing. But all of these rabbis each had their own. So it's something that kind of it's a question that I'm raising. What happens to the creativity? How do all these rabbis each say their own personal prayer, but then we all say the same personal prayer? Should we actually be saying our own personal prayers, or at least should we have a selection of personal prayers that we could choose from at the end of our davening, which there are. but there's just really this richness in this source. And the final one about Rav Sheshet, and when he would sit and fast, also reminds us that rabbis would choose their own personal fast days. And this is something that people can do as well. I mean, it's not, people can always do a Ta'anit Yachid, an individual fast. It's interesting to think about how exactly was how different was their religious experience, or their experience of piety, similar or different from ours. Some of these prayers make it into our Siddur, something exactly, yeah. And some of them make it into our Siddur in interesting moments, like some of them are in our day-to-day prayers, and some of them, one of them is the Birkat Rosh Chodesh that we say, and one other short tradition that is not from Brachot, it's from Sukkah. So I went through all of Brachot, not like cataloging all of the traditions of personal behavior. That's where personally I'm at right now with my own research, but as I do Daf Yomi, and so I mark the pages that I'm going to do afterwards, come back and catalog. And this example, when I was doing Masachet Sukkah, just stood out, and I've remembered it since because it's so interesting to me. So this is in the sugya on waving your lulav, waving the lulav, when to wave it, when you, at what moments. And the Bavli brings us this fascinating short tradition about Rav Acha bar Yaakov. When he would wave his lulav, Rav Acha bar Yaakov, mamtile umaytile, amar, den gira be'enei desitna. This is an arrow in the eye of Satan. And he would say this about his lulav. I love this tradition because it reveals another dimension of how Rav Acha bar Yaakov, or how whoever was recording or transmitting this, had another realm of the mitzvah of lulav. It wasn't just performing the mitzvah of Ulkachtem Lachem, but that's in the Torah, but it was also, he saw the lulav, and also, I mean, we can also think about the lulav as maybe looking like a weapon. He really felt or saw the lulav as also a tool to battle with Satan. We can talk about what that means. What does it mean to be in battle with Satan? How the rabbis thought about Satan. Like, there are lots of conversations that can be had about that. It's just so fascinating to me that, what this tradition reveals about how for Rav Acha bar Yaakov, this was also part of his lulav experience. And what is also amazing about this tradition is that the Gemara so someone recorded this, and then perhaps a later generation in the Gemara, unclear, adds a note. Maybe this is happening in the same generation. Velav miltahi mishum de'ate legaroyebe. So this is not a proper manner of conduct, as if we provoke Satan, he will actually bother us more. And what this, so on the one hand, the Gemara is recording this tradition of personal behavior, but then clearly marking it as something that we should not imitate, because we should not provoke Satan like Rav Acha bar Yaakov did, which also is just really interesting on how they interacted with Satan. I've thought about thought about what was proper interaction with Satan through mitzvot. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how, the way the Stammet Gemara kind of finishes that off, like fits really well with, stuff that I've seen about Shadim and Masechet Pesachim. But I'm also, yeah, it's in which like they kind of say that if you don't worry too much about demons, they're not going to affect you. But I'm also kind of wondering too about the way some like later person in or group of people in like the development of Gemara are it's like the tension between recording it but then saying not to do it, which just kind of seems to go against like the usual kind of development. I mean, sometimes like opinions get kind of like thrown out in favor of another, but just kind of saying this isn't the way to do something that one of the Chachamim is saying is just kind of, it's interesting. And I just wonder like when that can happen and when it can't. And
yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. So I can tell you of two more. I don't know if I can give you when it can happen or when it can't, but I can think of two more examples where the Gemara, so usually we know that the Gemara does make comments like Hilchata like this, right? Hilchata is like this position, and then it's more of a positive statement. You should behave in accordance with this rabbi, or the Halakha is in accordance with this rabbi. Here, this is basically a negative statement. Do not behave in accordance with this rabbi, or what this rabbi did really should not be imitated. Last week in the there was one example that I gave about a rabbi who made the blessing of the myrtle, the hadas, before the blessing of the oil, and his colleague chastising him for this, and he said, but the halakha is like Rava, that really this is what I should be doing. And then the Gemara comments on this tradition and says that it is not true. He invented this to stop being chastised, to get himself out of this situation. So he invented a memra so as for his colleague to let him go, to leave him be. So it's not the exact, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. And then also in I can think of Kiddushin, there's a statement that a certain rabbi makes about the Jews of a certain area. There's discussion of lineage. I don't want to get into it too much, but there's also an example there where the Gemara kind of shoots down the statement of a certain rabbi and says, no, that's really not true. He's just saying that because of a different reason. Is this perhaps, so reading just the chat, that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov's approach was common in the communities and had to be censored. Yeah, I mean, we can make a lot of conjectures. It could be really interesting to think about what this means exactly and why the Gemara has a need to shoot this down, or and just the dynamic between recording it and then shooting it down is just really really great. I think very characteristic of the Gemara in a sense, that it and also just raises also questions about why is this personal behavior being recorded. It could be, I think it does reveal, and we'll see this in the last example, sages and communities, religious communities, not only Jews, also Christians as well during this time, they're all battling with Satan. It's also interesting, like Satan is Demons are of a certain, I would say, Satan and the demons are not. They're not on the same level. Here he's clearly battling with Satan. It's not the demons. It's not mazikim. It's Satan. So the last example is about Kriyat Shema of the nighttime. And Kriyat Shema of the nighttime was connected to, as there's a statement in the middle of the Yerushalmi, not a tradition of personal behavior, just a more theoretical statement. רבי הונא בשם רב יוסף, מתם אמרו אדם צריך לקרוא שמע ביתו בערב בשביל להבריח את המזיקים. So the reason that a person needs to say Shema in the evening is to ward off the mazikim, the demons. There's just, I mean, there are several things going on in the sugya. It's a long sugya, relatively, that brings three traditions of personal behavior. We can see this bolded, Rabbi Yasa, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, and then Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. And then within the traditions of personal behavior, we have discussion. And the three traditions of personal behavior are brought as proofs for less connected to demons. This is more of a halachic conversation. Whether or not someone can talk after or say anything after they say the nighttime Shema. And they bring proofs saying that one can talk, study, or say Tehillim. And it's interesting that these are all considered on the same level. There's no distinction made in the sugya between, well, you can't talk, but you can learn, or you can't learn, but you can say Tehillim. No, which we could totally make these distinctions, but this sugya does not make these distinctions. You're either silent or you're not silent. And then within this sugya, there's this outright statement that really this Shema, the Shema of the nighttime, is to ward off the demons, and perhaps the Gemara connects this perhaps to the reason why you can't talk afterwards, because it ruins the protection, maybe. So the first tradition of personal behavior is about Rabbi Yasa, who would instruct the students or the colleagues or the fellows who are studying. And this is a borderline tradition of personal behavior. The reason I view it as within the realm of traditions of personal behavior is because it is an instruction to rabbis in their own personal lives. It's not an instruction to what we might call a common Jew. But this is on the border because the rabbi here is functioning as someone who is giving instruction, but it's instruction for the personal lives of the students. So anyway, what he's telling them is, if you want to study in Beitun mit'aska beoraita, atun karya shma kodem chatzot u'mit'askim. So so this is connected to the sages ruling that the Shema of nighttime has to be said before midnight, before Chatzot. And so Rabbi Yasa instructed his students, if you want to learn Torah at night and stay up really late, you should first say Shema before midnight and then learn Torah. Like, make sure to say Shema before you learn Torah. This tradition of personal behavior is not focused on whether one can or cannot talk after saying Shema. It's on the timing of the Shema. But the Gemara uses this to say that you can talk after saying Shema. The way it's formulated here is Miltei amara she'halakha kechachamim. So right, first of all, halakha is like chachamim. You have to say it until Chatzot, until midnight, the Shema. מילתי אמרה שאומר דברים אחר אמת ויציב. So אמת ויציv is almost part and parcel because it's the blessing after Shema. So, and Emet V'Yatziv here, we say Emet V'Yatziv in the morning, but they said the same bracha, Emet V'Yatziv, not Emet V'Emunah, also at night. So they're talking here about Emet V'Yatziv of the nighttime. And they infer from this that you you can say things after Emet V'Yatziv of the nighttime, because they could study Torah after they said Shema. And then there's this statement about the mazikim, about how the Shema needs to ward off the demons, and therefore miltei amara she'en omer dvarim achar emet v'yatziv. This means that you should not say anything after the Shema of the nighttime, after emet v'yatziv. And then the Gemara brings another tradition of personal behavior that says the same thing. And let's see this tradition because it's really beautiful. רבי שמואל בר נחמני, כדבן אחית לעיבורה, הווה מקבל גבי רבי יעקב גרוסה. והווה רבי זעירה מתעמר בעיני קופיה. משמעינה החווה קרי. There should be another קרי וחזר וקרי, עד דאהבה שקע מיני גושנתה. So, what is the setting? The setting is, and we'll read it here in English, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani would descend for the intercalation, for the ibuk, for adding another month to the year. And when he would go, he was received by Rabbi Yaakov, the Grutzmiller, and Rabbi Zeira was a student, was hiding among the crates, or we should actually translate the baskets, to hear how he read the Shema. He read it over and over again until he drifted away and slept. So let's see this again in the Aramaic. So we have this beautiful scene, in my eyes, of a rabbi who's being hosted and probably put up in a shed or machsan, like a storage place with baskets. And Rabbi Zeira, who was a student, would hide behind the baskets and observe, to hear. Also here it's not it's to observe, it's to observe with his eyes, but it's to hear also with his senses how he would read Shema. And the way he would read Shema is that he would recite Shema over and over and over and over and over again until he would fall asleep. And something about the image of a student observing a rabbi hiding, fall asleep while they're saying Shema. There's something really intimate about this moment, and about the moment of drifting into sleep, the moment of falling asleep. When we think about watching someone fall asleep, I think it's a moment that people in an intimate relationship, whether parents and children or lovers, observe each other fall asleep. And here we have Rabbi Zeira, a student, observing his rabbi falling asleep on this, and also the chanting over and over and over and over again of Shema. It's just an interesting way. I'm going back to the topic that focused here now on practices of personal piety. We see here personal way, the way that Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani would recite the nighttime Shema. He would be it's very different from how we think about reciting Shema in order to fulfill an obligation. He's not reciting it in a sense to fulfill an obligation. He really is reciting it as a chant to help him fall asleep, to ward off demons, something of that sort. And it's a very different kind of religious practice. And just the final tradition, which is brought by the sugya as a machloket, as a different opinion, in a sense, that you can say things after Emet V'Yatziv. But I don't think that that's what this tradition in its original state was. That's not what its purpose was, or what it was supposed to convey. So the Gemara says, "Miltei de Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi pliga," disputing this because Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi kare mizmori batre. He would recite mizmorim. He would recite Tehillim after saying Shema, and the Gemara uses this to infer that you can't say things after Medveyatzi. But if we think about the context or the practice of piety, or just practice of magic, or somewhere in between, of warding off the demons, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi would say Shema, but then he would continue with reciting Tehillim that also was he used it as a way of protecting himself at night. We see here these different examples of. Stop the share. If anyone has any questions, we have 5 minutes left about these examples, and then maybe I'll just give a short summary.
I'm sorry for just unmuting instead of raising my hand. I was just wondering, like you mentioned earlier that like different rabbis and different Tanaim and Amoraim had like different practices of how they would worship God, and you seemed, I don't want to attribute emotions to you that you didn't have, but like you seem to express happiness that like that there's all this diversity within rabbinic literature, and kind of regret that there isn't that diversity and different ways of worshiping God, or whatever we were doing, even if it was just cultural practices now. Like, what do you think brought on this like formalization that like, like the Gemara is just talking about like different rabbis have all these different practices, and isn't it great, and isn't it lovely, and isn't pluralism awesome? And and we kind of just like standardized that and just like made a text. Like what brought that about?
Yeah. I mean, thanks. Yeah, I think it is a shame, or just it's something that is just very different from our religious, the culture of the way our liturgy, and we don't have, in a sense, variety possible. It's just different, yeah, I mean, you can decide if you think it's nice or a shame, or just but so I appreciate your question. I think that so first of all, it's not that they all said the set Shmoneh, so that's the way it's presented, at least, and then these are personal prayers that they said after it. So they have this kind of dynamic of both a combination of set prayers and then their own personal prayers that they would add onto it at the end. What we see already in the dynamics of I think this is something that is not, this is already happening in rabbinic literature itself. Already has this dynamic of codification and imitation, to the extent of it becoming codified, of personal or individual acts of piety. In the first examples that we saw, that a rabbi would bow in a certain way or say a certain prayer, and then he would explain, because I saw Rabbi so-and-so do this, because I heard Rabbi so-and-so do this. So they're already imitating their predecessors, and also the rabbinic literature itself, or the Gemara, it presents rabbis' behaviors as in a sense almost halachically binding, or they need to say, this is not halachically binding, do not do this. So there's, I think this already happens in the rabbinic among the rabbis themselves, and then it's already in the Gemara, the dynamic of the Gemara, and the dynamic of this becoming kind of unified, codified, and also intended for broader groups of people. It has to be more unified, I think. Yeah, Emily, you are also here.
So I guess also in light of what you just said of the question, I actually think there is probably more of this variations that there are more variations, in particular in liturgy and in synagogue practice. We might not notice them because the change happens kind of slowly. I mean, I think of, on a very grand scale, Hasidut, right? In the 18th and 19th centuries, those, we've become accustomed to some of those patterns of prayer, the idea of all sorts of, even choreography and behavior in prayer. In a Hasidic, amongst Hasidim, so many Hasidic practices are sort of idiosyncratic, they're different. And, but also it makes, then also in certain Sephardic, Middle Eastern communities, there are, and I'm old enough to see, to have witnessed certain, practices. I have lots of examples of them. Reading these things have triggered all these, thoughts in my head of when, when as things are not as codified, it's not as rigid as we think.
Right.
And the other thing I thought of is, all of this, what you've been teaching for the few weeks, I've been thinking about how it works for women's halachot that relate to women in particular. So an easy one might be behaviors of women when they light candles, prayers that they add to chinot, the tchinas and things. But then also, and this, certain halachot that only, like for instance, Hilchot Nidah, right? Which was passed on, transmitted mother to daughter, right? Totally in that way. Women never had, until the 20th century, books about, or access to any kind of text about how to observe these mitzvot. And I just wonder how much variation in behavior and even ritual that might have become normative happens as a result of those kind of, imitative transmissions, children observing parents. I think this is more widespread,
right?
Only in the Gemara. And I'll just say one other thing is that, and I think anybody who lives kind of an observant life sort of, let's say, actually, there's always the halakha, but then also, but how does it work in real life? I think about this actually for women, and this is, again, it's good for women in particular, or couples, I guess. Hilchot Nidah is the one thing that we don't learn from childhood. So there's, in other words, how do we do Shabbat? We learn Shabbat by watching our families. We learn how to pray a lot by watching models in shul, parents, rabbis, other people. Hilchot Nidah, like the laws pertaining to marriage, everybody is new to it at a certain stage in life. And there's this question of, like, you can teach it from a book, but then there's this looming question of how does it really work in real life? How do people observe it? Do you really do that? Or how do you handle this? And I think also newly observant people go through probably like, a process. You can only learn so much in a book, but then you need to see, how does it work in real life? How do you really do this? Is it, so those are, sort of thoughts that have been going through my head throughout the 3 classes. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything that you said. I think, I love it. I think it's, I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, if I may just add to that, there's something I was thinking about in terms of, kind of like women's personal practices that get handed down versus these things that are recorded in the Talmud, is that, in a way, I think there's a way of looking at these kinds of personal practices in the Talmud and saying, oh, like the Tanaim, the Amoraim, like they're, if you want to say they had Ruach HaKodesh, and so like it was okay for them to do whatever because they knew that it was like a valid thing. I think that's something that, people say. And I think that, and then, sometimes those practices will get encoded into Halakha, and just because of like the kind of authority they have. Whereas, thinking about like a tchinas and like certain things around lighting candles and stuff, those are all kind of like, in a way, those are able to kind of develop and people are able to kind of do their own things with it because it's like not considered like, halakhically binding or something that's necessarily going to set a halakhic precedent. And yeah, so I guess I'm just wondering, I guess, but there are certain things that it's just like, this is the way the community does it, so that becomes the halakha. And so I'm just wondering like where that kind of distinction is, like when it's something that remains personal and like a halakhic, and when it kind of gets like codified like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think those are great questions. Part of it has to do just with the time that it happened in, or the time that it's the gestures during prayer that happen, that are recorded in the Gemara, are different from gestures during prayer that happen later on, millennia later. That is but it's a great questions, and I mean, this really does touch on minhag in general, has its weight from being something that is imitated, and something that the community does. A part of the reason that I really like these traditions of rabbinic personal behavior is that there is this distinction between, scholars make a distinction also in learn halakha, like between minhag, that is something popular of the common people, and then like the rabbis. Right? The commoners create minhag, and the rabbis create halakha. The rabbis are the judiciaries. The rabbis are make psak halakha, create prescriptions, and the people are the ones that create the practices and imitate each other's behavior. And these traditions, to a certain extent, break this dichotomy, because the rabbis are also learning here in a mimetic way. It's not through prescriptions, it's through behaving and observing and imitating. But then on the other hand, because they are rabbis, and because they are, or because they're sages, because they're rabbis, because they're in the Gemara, their behavior becomes codified as halakha in ways that are similar and not similar to dynamics that happen in halakha around minhagim. So it is interesting to think about the similarities and differences between these kinds of traditions and traditions about minhagim, and yeah.
Okay, well, we're a little bit over time. Thank you, everyone, and especially Dr. Koren for sticking with us. And yeah, I think you also mentioned to me that this is a relatively new area of research for you. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what else comes from this line of inquiry. It's I guess you can tell from like all of the discussion afterward, like just kind of how rich it is. So really excited for that. And yeah, I guess this is the last class of this series, but the Sphera Zman is still going for a couple of more weeks. So hopefully we'll see you at some other Drisha classes before Shavuot. So yeah, I'll let you go and enjoy your evenings now. Thank you so much.